Hi, everyone. My name is Diwaker, and I am the VP of Technology at Hiro Systems. At Hiro, we make developer tools for Stacks and Bitcoin. If you're not familiar with Stacks, it's a layer one blockchain with a novel consensus algorithm and a smart contract language with a unique connection to Bitcoin. Today, I want to talk to you about smart contracts for Bitcoin. Now, I started working full-time in crypto just about 2 years ago, and people are always asking me about, what was it like to make the transition into crypto? And I tell people that one of the things I absolutely love about the space is the openness to new ideas and the willingness to experiment. But in some circles, saying things like DeFi on Bitcoin or smart contracts for Bitcoin can be confusing at best and triggering at worst. So before we go any further, let me just start by defining what I mean by smart contracts for Bitcoin. Now, you may have a different definition, but this is a definition that I'm using for this talk. All right, so like Bitcoin, we want our smart contracts to be permissionless, and they need the whole environment to be permissionless, which is to say that anyone should be able to deploy a contract, anyone should be able to call into an existing contract. We also want a trust minimized system. So a contract author should not need to trust the miners or any other actors in the blockchain ecosystem. If I'm a developer or a user, I shouldn't have to trust the author of the smart contract. Anyone should be able to verify the execution of a smart contract after the fact. Now, obviously, you want the smart contract to be able to react to state changes in Bitcoin. And ideally, you also want the smart contract to be able to write back to Bitcoin, make changes to Bitcoin. So those are the requirements that I'm considering for smart contracts for Bitcoin. So any system that satisfies these would be a candidate. Now, notice that I'm not including the expressing the logic of the smart contract itself. That does not need to be on-chain on Bitcoin. Now, as we all know, Bitcoin is limited in its expressivity. And so in this set of requirements, it's fine if the actual logic resides elsewhere, or like on some other blockchain or some other system. So with these set of requirements, let's consider the Stacks blockchain. So the Stacks mainnet went live on January 14th of this year. So it's been about 6 months since launch. In the 6 months since launch, there's been tremendous growth and activity in the ecosystem. Stacks miners have spent north of 600 Bitcoin in mining Stacks. And in today's prices, that's over 25 million US dollars. These are independent miners all over the world. Developers have deployed more than close to 150 smart contracts that have been called into over 70,000 times. Anyone can mine. It's a totally permissionless system. Anyone can run a node. Anyone can deploy contracts. If you want to learn more about Stacks, I highly recommend checking out this essay that I've linked to here, just to get a flavor for what kind of blockchain Stacks really is. But that's just a little bit about the blockchain. Now let's look at Clarity, the smart contract language for Stacks. So Clarity was designed from the ground up for a blockchain environment. It makes some deliberate set of trade-offs for safety and security. So first, Clarity is decidable, meaning that you can know precisely what a contract would cost before you execute it. It's highly amenable to static analysis. It is not Turing complete by design. So certain kinds of recursion and dynamic dispatch are just not possible. And these are often sources of bugs in other environments. Clarity is interpreted, so the actual contract code goes on chain. So anyone can read it. It's a completely human readable representation. There is no intermediate bytecode or compiler, which can, again, often be surface areas for bugs. Clarity is functional and statically typed, which means that there is possibilities to build very sophisticated tooling in the future. And Clarity also has a unique notion of what are called postconditions. So postconditions are set by users, and what they let the user do is control what a smart contract would do without necessarily knowing the internals of the smart contract. So for example, a user might say, I don't necessarily trust the smart contract or the author of the smart contract. I want to try it out, but I'm going to put a limit that this smart contract can't move more than 10 STX from my account or something along those lines. And again, this gives the user unprecedented control over what is happening to their accounts and their assets. So that's a little bit about Clarity. Now let's look at clarity on stacks in the context of the requirements that I laid out earlier. So I would argue that based on what we've seen in the ecosystem so far, clarity on stacks meets the bar for being a permissionless environment and a trustless environment. Now, the key questions are, can a clarity contract react to events happening on the Bitcoin chain? And they absolutely can. And let's take a look at a real world example from just last week. So someone in the Stacks community recently executed a trustless swap of an NFT on Bitcoin using a clarity contract on Stacks. Here's how it worked. First, you transfer the NFT to a smart contract on Stacks. Next, you send a regular Bitcoin transaction on Bitcoin, nothing to do with Stacks. This triggers something in the smart contract, and the smart contract verifies that the Bitcoin payment actually happened. And this verification is happening on Stacks. And when this verification is complete, the smart contract can release the NFT to the payee. So again, note that the only thing someone had to do to actually trigger the swap was send a regular Bitcoin transaction to a specific wallet. That's it. So how does all this work? Let's take a closer look. So this is the smart contract for executing the NFT swap. Obviously, you don't need to go through the whole contract here, but just note the two kind of public calls, one at the top and one at the bottom. So the call called create swap and the call called submit swap. So the first call is the one that's actually initiates the swap where you transfer the NFT into escrow essentially. And the submit swap is the call that releases the NFT from escrow when a transaction, BTC payment is verified. It's a little bit hard to see in the screenshot, maybe for viewers, but if you look at the very bottom of the screen, you'll notice that this smart contract actually calls into another contract, which has been already deployed on the mainnet. And this smart contract implements a parser for Bitcoin transactions. Let's take a quick look at this contract again. Here's just a snippet. And you can see there are functions for parsing a Bitcoin transaction and parsing a Bitcoin block header. I won't go into the details of how these contracts work. If you're curious, feel free to check them out. Just head on over to our Explorer or just search for Stacks Explorer and you can find them all in there. But the point is that because Stacks nodes already keep track of Bitcoin state. Again, I didn't go into the details of the Stacks consensus mechanism, but essentially Stacks has a notion of a burn chain, and all Stacks nodes are constantly keeping track of incoming Bitcoin blocks and transactions. And so because Stacks nodes are already keeping track of Bitcoin state, you can think of Stacks as a sort of a light client for Bitcoin. And clarity contracts, therefore, can access this Bitcoin state. Right now, there is some information that is available via native functions within Clarity. And for some additional functionalities, you can implement them as smart contracts like I just showed. And this set of things that are the access to Bitcoin state that is natively available through Clarity contracts, that's just going to increase over time. And then finally, this trustless swap mechanism, it easily generalizes to all other kinds of assets. So you can do a trustless swap for Stacks tokens or any other fungible tokens or any other asset types. And in fact, the same community member successfully executed all of these different types of swaps on the mainnet last week. And you can see a link to the transactions in this tweet. Okay, so now we've seen how Clarity contracts on Stacks can react to Bitcoin state. Now let's talk about, can Clarity contracts actually write back to Bitcoin? Can they make state changes on Bitcoin? Because then you have a really full-fledged system. So the interesting thing here is that merely broadcasting a transaction to Bitcoin is pretty straightforward. It's an easy thing to do in software. You construct some arbitrary payload, you broadcast it on the Bitcoin network. So sending such arbitrary payloads is easy, but not that interesting. What you really want is a Bitcoin transaction whose output depends on a Stacks transaction. And so again, imagine you have a smart contract that looks at something that happened on the Bitcoin chain, and it does something in response. And that does, doing something in response eventually should lead to a write back onto Bitcoin. And so we want to take the output of this smart contract execution and somehow incorporate that in the output of a Bitcoin transaction. And so really to do this, ideally what you would need is a light client for stacks in Bitcoin. So again, just as there is a light client for Bitcoin in stacks, and that allows the contracts to read and react to the state, ideally you'd have the inverse. Now, obviously, we all know that it's unlikely that Bitcoin itself would have a light client for any other blockchain as part of the protocol. But there's still hope. There are still ways of getting around this. So the key insight here is to think about what stacks miners are doing. They are generating Bitcoin transactions whose outputs are governed by the stacks consensus protocol. Again, you can look up details for the consensus mechanism and how it works. But the core insight there is large parts of the consensus mechanism in stacks are expressed in a smart contract. And what this smart contract does then influence the Bitcoin transaction that stacks miners sent out. And so we have this narrow wedge where we indeed have this capability. And so the question is it somehow possible to use this in a clever way? And without getting into too much details, I will just say that this is an active area of research in the stacks community right now. We have some very promising sort of ideas that we're exploring, and we're pretty optimistic that something along these lines can be worked out. So while full write back to Bitcoin is not yet available, there are some interesting things that are in the works. So with that, let's take a stack of kind of where we are. With Clarity on Stacks, you have a permissionless, trustless environment where smart contracts can react to Bitcoin state and can potentially in the future also change Bitcoin state under some constraints. Now, if Clarity on Stacks can enable smart contracts for Bitcoin, what can you do with it? Let's just take a few examples. So the first thing is you can create truly differentiated DeFi products on stacks. Imagine a negative interest loan that pays itself back over time, or an NFT that is earning a passive yield in Bitcoin, or programmable Bitcoin futures. These are all uniquely possible only on stacks because of the connection to Bitcoin and because of the consensus mechanism and because of the access to Bitcoin state that Clarity contracts can have. Another interesting aspect is around naming and identity. So stacks addresses have a one-to-one mapping with Bitcoin addresses. And names are first-class citizens on stacks. In fact, bulk of the naming system is also actually expressed as a smart contract that's part of the boot code of the blockchain. Now, this can enable all sorts of interesting use cases where you can use human-readable names and identifiers in wallets, in transfers for NFTs, and even potentially in other layer 2 systems on top of Bitcoin, like Lightning. The possibilities are really endless. We already talked about native trustless swaps on Bitcoin. There are several projects that are working on bringing some sort of wrapped or synthetic Bitcoin on stacks. There are also a few stablecoin projects in flight. In fact, Arcadico that I mentioned earlier is working on one stablecoin as well. And both of these things are crucial elements to allow the next wave of DeFi applications to be built on stacks. And of course, there's oracles. In other smart contract ecosystems, we've seen how oracles have emerged as a key building block to connect smart contracts with off-chain data. And back in May, we announced that Hiro was co-sponsoring a grant with Chainlink to integrate the Chainlink price feeds and other oracles natively on stacks. And so then you can just imagine the possibilities where if you can trigger a smart contract on stacks using Bitcoin, and this smart contract has access to stable coins and synthetic Bitcoin, oracles, it just opens up a world of possibilities in what can be built, which was simply not possible before. So coming back to what I was saying earlier, smart contracts for Bitcoin under the definitions that I used earlier, Clarity on Stacks meets those requirements and truly has endless possibilities. And I'm so excited just looking at what's happening in the ecosystem. There is a Stacks accelerator now in the ecosystem that's kind of funding teams that are building on stacks. Their first cohort has, I think, more than 25 teams and some really interesting projects that are coming out. So I'm super excited to see all of the activity in that ecosystem. So just some parting thoughts to wrap this up. First, as I talked about today, smart contracts for Bitcoin are indeed possible today with clarity on stacks. Now, sometimes I see a sense of resistance or resignation with respect to smart contracts. There's kind of this sense that solidity has won over, and so why bother? And I always find that quite weird and interesting because, obviously Ethereum and Solidity have done wonders for crypto in general and DeFi in particular. And I would argue that that actually is cause to demand more innovation in smart contracts and not less. If you draw the analogy with general purpose programming languages, people have been writing programming languages for 50 plus years now. But it doesn't mean that we have stopped building new programming languages or innovating on them. In fact, a lot of the popular languages these days in the blockchain space, even languages like Rust and Go or functional languages like Haskell, they're all very, very young languages. And given the fact that blockchains are a fundamentally different programming environment, I think it behooves us as an industry to demand more innovation, to push the limits of what's possible, rather than kind of giving up and saying, whatever exists is already as good as it gets. And finally, I would say, crypto as a space is still pretty small, still pretty nascent. For us who kind of inhabit the crypto echo chamber, it's sometimes hard to see this, but for people outside of the crypto bubble, most users, most developers don't really know or care about crypto. And so I would very much like all of us to, think about growing the pie for everyone and spreading what crypto can do for a broader audience, rather than getting into tribal infighting within different projects. There are some amazing projects and amazing teams to learn from, and that's what I really like about this space. All right, before I sign off, just two quick plugs. If you're interested in learning about Clarity, whether you're an individual or a company or an organization, check out Clarity Universe. It's an initiative by the nonprofit Stacks Foundation, which is the governing body behind the Stacks blockchain. And you'll find all sorts of resources. And then if you enjoyed some of the things that I mentioned, if you're passionate about building developer tools, or if you're just curious about Stacks, we at Hiro are hiring. We have a lot of open roles. If you or someone you know is interested, please do apply. With that, I thank you for your time. If you have any questions or feedback, please hit me up on Twitter. And I also want to thank the organizers for having me on and for putting together such a great conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Diwaker. Appreciate that insight.